Have you ever wondered what happens when a royal princess trades tiaras for chisels and paintbrushes? Meet Princess Louise Caroline Alberta, the rebellious daughter of Queen Victoria who dared to break with tradition. She blazed her own trail as a groundbreaking sculptor, champion of women's education, and a spirited adventurer in the Canadian Rockies. In this video, we'll take you behind palace walls to uncover her hidden artistic genius, her unexpected marriage that shook British society, and her bold journey across the Atlantic. From crafting statues of her own mother to inspiring the name of Lake Louise, Princess Louise turned Victorian expectations upside down. Get ready to discover a remarkable story of creativity, courage, and quiet rebellion that still echoes in history's halls today. Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold royal secrets. Louise Caroline Alberta grew up surrounded by tutors, attendants, and the high expectations of Queen Victoria, yet she always seemed to have a mind all her own. From the time she could read, she would pepper her governesses with endless questions about art, history, music, and languages. She was the sixth child of a growing family. Brothers and sisters ranged from the serious and dutiful Victoria to the future Edward VII. Edward, destined for the throne, possessed a certain regal composure, while others, like Alice and Beatrice, displayed varying degrees of introversion or social grace. Louise found herself in the middle, perpetually curious, rarely content simply to follow tradition. If life in Buckingham Palace had a script, she was determined to rewrite a few lines of it. Her father, Prince Albert, noticed early on that she had a lively spirit that flourished through creativity, while her mother, the formidable Queen Victoria, maintained strict regimens for all the children, daily lessons in French, German, English grammar, hours of music practice, and drills on court etiquette. Louise found a secret refuge in sketching. Sometimes during afternoon lessons, she would surreptitiously draw shapes, faces, and swirling patterns in the margins of her notebooks. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to make sense of her world when it felt too constrained by expectation. Prince Albert, more liberal-minded than his wife, quietly approved. On a few occasions, he encouraged her to explore real art materials, lumps of clay, blocks of wood for carving, or plaster that she could mold. These sessions, however brief, lit a spark of excitement that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Tragedy struck the family in 1861 when Louise was 13. Prince Albert died, sending Queen Victoria into a deep, unyielding grief. The atmosphere at Buckingham Palace grew dark, draped in heavy mourning fabrics, and the Queen withdrew from many public duties. Those who worked within the palace noticed how the once lively halls became nearly silent. Louise herself felt torn. She wanted to mourn her father's passing, but she was also entering adolescence and yearned to continue developing her artistic interests. Instead, she found herself more tightly bound to her mother, who now leaned on her children, especially Louise, for companionship. The young princess attempted to comply, but her restless energy and creative drive chafed against the Queen's strict rules of decorum. If Louise tried to slip away for a moment, to draw or to stroll unobserved in the gardens, she was often summoned back to sit beside Victoria, to be a constant reminder of the family unity the Queen desperately clung to. Those teenage years forged in her a determination to pursue her passions whenever she could. She saw her siblings alternating between compliant subservience to royal duty and their own private desires. Some, like Victoria and Alice, seemed more willing to let themselves be shaped by the Queen's will. Edward, while rebellious in his own ways, was weighed down by the knowledge that he would one day rule. But Louise understood that, As a daughter not in the direct line to the throne, she possessed a kind of flexibility. Where others might see limitation, she saw an opening. She pressed for the chance to study art in a formal setting. Time and again, she dropped hints, wrote letters, and cajoled her mother. Queen Victoria balked at first. Princesses could dabble in drawing or watercolors, but a rigorous professional training in sculpture was unconventional, even scandalous for a royal woman. Yet, perhaps recalling that Prince Albert had been an advocate for modern ideas, Queen Victoria eventually relented. So Louise became one of the rare royal daughters to enroll at the National Art Training School, later the Royal College of Art, in London. Attending that institution changed her life. For once, she could be just one student among many, all grappling with plaster molds and clay figures. She was no less royal, of course. Her carriage arrived daily to drop her off, and she had attendants waiting in the wings. But within the school's studios, among easels and half-finished sculptures, she tasted a new kind of freedom. Teachers who initially worried about how to critique a princess's work soon discovered that Louise craved honest feedback. She stayed late in the workshop, adjusting the angle of a figure's arm, refining the curve of a subject's face. She spoke candidly with fellow students, asking them about their own lives and absorbing the stories of those who came from the working class or from families that struggled to afford tuition. It was an education in more than just art. It opened her eyes to a broader social reality. Back in the palace, she began to fill her private apartments with clay pieces, sketches, and sculpture tools. Queen Victoria, loath to see her sumptuous carpets stained by plaster dust, frequently complained. Yet Louise held her ground, insisting that this creative mess was part of her process. Over time, her mother begrudgingly allowed it, perhaps seeing that Louise was happier and more cooperative when permitted to continue her artistic pursuits. Still, their relationship remained tense. The queen liked to monitor her children's reading material, clothing, and daily schedules, while Louise sought wiggle room to discover her own voice. The friction never broke their bond entirely, but it added an undercurrent of rebellion to Louise's otherwise polite demeanors at court. As the late 1860s rolled into the early 1870s, rumors circulated about who Louise might marry. Royal tradition dictated that British princesses often wed princes from European dynasties, forging alliances that bolstered the monarchy's ties abroad. Louise, however, had no particular desire to follow that path. Whether out of patriotism or genuine preference, she looked instead to someone closer to home. John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, a Scottish nobleman, rose as a candidate. Although still aristocratic, he wasn't a foreign prince. This fact alone rattled many in the royal circle, who whispered that it was too modern a choice, an affront to centuries of custom. Queen Victoria, recognizing an opportunity to secure goodwill among the British aristocracy, eventually agreed. Their wedding in 1871 made headlines not just for its pageantry. Windsor Castle gleamed with floral arrangements, musicians filled the chapel with hymns, and nobility packed every pew, but also for its departure from tradition. Louise, wearing an elegant gown with a train that glided over polished marble floors, exchanged vows before a host of onlookers who still whispered in the aisles about how unusual it was for a British princess to marry a non-royal. For Louise, the event felt both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. She hoped marriage might grant her a measure of independence from her mother, allowing her to devote more time to art and to the philanthropic projects she was starting to champion. In the early days of marriage, Louise balanced the role of a dutiful wife with her continuing artistic interests. She hosted dinners and receptions to support charities, exploring areas like education for girls, nursing programs, and public health initiatives. She also set aside studio time to craft sculptures. Some works remained private. She didn't want the scrutiny of critics who might dismiss her efforts as a mere royal hobby. Others she eventually submitted to exhibitions under discreet pseudonyms. She was meticulous, learning the different properties of marble and bronze, collaborating with foundries to ensure a professional finish. Contemporary artists who interacted with her were often surprised by her genuine commitment to the craft. She wasn't content to simply create decorative figurines for palace mantels. She aimed for pieces that could stand on their own merit in a public space. Yet, public scrutiny never quite let up. Society papers breathlessly speculated about when children would arrive. As the years passed and no child appeared, rumors turned salacious. Some claimed that John Campbell was uninterested in women, others that Louise suffered from undisclosed health issues, or that she simply didn't want the constraints of motherhood. The couple remained tight-lipped. The truth of their marriage was known only to them, but observers noted a certain polite distance between husband and wife at public engagements. Still, they presented a united front, cooperating dutifully in official events, official travel, and philanthropic galas. Louise discovered that in the absence of children, she had more freedom to shape her schedule around art and charity. In 1878, John Campbell was appointed Governor-General of Canada, and the couple moved to Ottawa, a vast leap from the courtly life of London. Stepping onto Canadian soil, Louise discovered a world that felt raw and expansive. She marveled at the forests, rivers, and the crispness of the Canadian winters. Initially, formal ceremonies and official receptions greeted her at every turn. She dutifully performed these obligations, meeting local leaders and being photographed at events. Yet, it was the spontaneous experiences, like ice skating on the frozen Rideau Canal or traveling by sleigh to see the countryside, that she found most thrilling. She threw herself into Canadian life with an enthusiasm that endeared her to many locals, and they, in turn, seemed delighted that a British princess was willing to step out of palace confines and relish the natural beauty of their land. During their Canadian tenure, she also seized opportunities to support public causes. She visited hospitals, identifying ways to improve resources in outlying areas, and engaged with women's groups that advocated for better access to education. On trips to rural communities, she took note of the lack of schooling options for girls and occasionally used her personal funds, or the influence of her position, to channel support where it was needed. Her love for the scenery manifested in numerous sketches and small paintings. Pine forests and mountain lakes found their way onto her canvases. She grew particularly fond of the Canadian Rockies, and a spectacular lake in Alberta was named Lake Louise in her honor. Yet, the unpredictability of life struck her again in 1880, when she had a serious accident during a sleigh ride. Thrown onto the hard ice, she sustained a head injury that haunted her afterward, with chronic headaches and lingering fatigue. Doctors in Canada did what they could, but the era's medical knowledge of concussions was limited. Though she attempted to continue her public engagements, her pain eventually forced her to return to England for rest and more specialized care. Her absence was keenly felt in Canada, where she had carved out a reputation as a sympathetic and approachable vice-regal consort. Many Canadians wrote letters expressing their hope for her swift recovery, a testament to how quickly she had become a beloved figure. Back home, Louise began a new chapter, dividing her time between Kensington Palace in London and various estates in Scotland, once John Campbell inherited the title of the 9th Duke of Argyll. She was now in her 30s, confident in her artistic abilities, and quietly aligned with various social causes. She had cultivated friendships with avant-garde artists, intellectuals, and even early advocates of women's rights, people who might have seemed an unlikely circle for a princess. Some in polite society frowned upon her associations, muttering that they were too radical, but Louise remained steadfast. Her philanthropic work grew. She sponsored scholarships at schools for girls, promoted better training for nurses, and advocated for philanthropic societies that provided relief to the poor in industrial cities like London and Glasgow. Queen Victoria, growing older and more isolated since Prince Albert's death, continued to keep a wary eye on Louise's activities. Though the Queen was proud of her daughter's public service, she often worried that Louise's outspokenness, for instance, her mild support of women's property rights, could drag the crown into controversial territory. Louise navigated these tensions with caution, rarely issuing overt political statements, but offering discreet support and donations to organizations pushing for incremental reforms. She recognized that many of the suffragettes, for instance, fought a steep uphill battle, facing imprisonment and societal scorn. A princess could not easily join them on protest marches, but she could slip funds their way or use her influence to ease their path. Letters from that period suggest she occasionally met with activists in private, listening to their experiences and encouraging them to keep pushing. As the final decades of the 19th century passed, Louise often exhibited some of her sculptures publicly, sometimes under her name, sometimes under aliases. Critics, initially skeptical of the royal sculptress, began to acknowledge her talent. One of her more famous works was a statue of her mother, Queen Victoria, placed outside Kensington Palace. Creating such a monumental piece was both an artistic challenge and an emotional one. Their relationship had always been complicated. Louise felt pride in capturing her mother's likeness, yet every chisel into the block of stone held echoes of their past disagreements. The resulting statue stood as both an homage and a subtle emblem of her own artistic skill. Tourists who glance at it today might not realize the profound personal layers it holds. With the dawn of the 20th century, Louise's life continued to evolve. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and Edward VII, Louise's brother, became king. Court life loosened somewhat from the rigid protocols that had marked Victoria's long reign. Though Louise was by then in her early 50s, she embraced the more relaxed atmosphere to expand her artistic circles. She also spent more time in Scotland, retreating to the highland landscapes that reminded her of Canada's wide horizons. The estate at Rosneath offered her a quieter space to sculpt, paint, and reflect on the swirl of changes transforming the modern world. She took joy in simpler pastimes, too: short horseback rides, gardening, and lively correspondence with friends who shared her enthusiasm for art and philanthropy. The onset of World War I in 1914 galvanized her philanthropic energies yet again. While some members of the extended royal family maintained a respectful distance from the gritty realities of war relief, Louise took practical steps to aid the wounded. She coordinated efforts to convert parts of Rosneath Castle into a convalescent facility where soldiers could recuperate in cleaner, less crowded conditions than many hospitals provided. She helped organize drives for medical supplies and warm clothing, using her high connections to persuade donors. Reports described her personally greeting wounded soldiers, listening to their stories, and ensuring they had both medical attention and some semblance of comfort during their recovery. As bombs fell on battlefields across Europe, she refused to be just a symbolic figurehead and worked diligently to provide real support. In the midst of this wartime turmoil, she experienced personal loss once more. John Campbell died in 1914. Despite the polite distance that characterized much of their marriage, the shock of his passing weighed heavily on her. They had shared a life of public duty, countless official engagements, and the quieter bond of partnership, however unconventional. Now, Louise faced the world as a widow with no children to help carry her legacy forward. Friends noticed a strain in her demeanor, particularly as the war dragged on and the casualty lists climbed. Still, she pressed on with relief efforts and tried to maintain her own creative pursuits, though time and energy grew scarcer. By the end of World War I, Louise was in her 70s. Britain emerged from the conflict battered and disillusioned, with social changes on the horizon. Women had finally begun to secure the right to vote in stages, an achievement Louise applauded quietly. She recognized that the seeds of women's empowerment she had helped plant were finally bearing fruit. Yet progress also brought upheaval. Traditional royal ceremonies fell out of step with an era grappling with economic difficulties and social unrest. Some questioned the relevance of the monarchy altogether. Louise, by now somewhat removed from daily court life, still believed in using her position for charitable works. Even as her health grew more fragile, she continued to suffer the long-term effects of her Canadian accident and the usual ailments of advanced age. She found ways to champion orphanages, veterans' charities, and educational funds. During the 1920s and 1930s, she lived mostly in semi-retirement. Kensington Palace remained her primary base in London, a place where she entertained a small circle of friends. Sometimes she journeyed back to Scotland for fresh air and a reprieve from city life. She kept in touch with relatives scattered across Europe, many of whom found themselves in precarious positions after the wave of revolutions and conflicts that had reshaped the continent. Her letters, preserved in various archives, reveal her continuing curiosity about world affairs. She would inquire about how technological changes, like aviation or radio, were transforming ordinary lives, or comment on the rise of new artistic movements that she found invigorating, even if they departed from her classical training. As the 1930s advanced, the specter of another global conflict loomed. Louise, by then in her 80s, witnessed the ominous developments with a sense of weary sorrow. She had lived through one world war and could hardly bear the notion of another. Yet events in Europe suggested that peace was fragile. She continued to correspond with acquaintances on the continent, hoping diplomacy would prevail. Her own health, meanwhile, became a pressing concern. Age compounded the migraines and exhaustion she had endured for decades. Close associates observed that she remained sharp-witted in conversation, retaining a playful sense of humor, yet she tired quickly. She died on December 3, 1939, in the midst of gathering storms of war. At 91, she had outlived nearly all her siblings. London was already adapting to blackout regulations, and the tension of impending conflict gripped the nation. Her passing, while noted, did not stir the kind of large-scale public mourning that might have occurred in a more peaceful era. She was laid to rest at the Royal Burial Ground in Frogmore, near her parents. In the quiet hush of that resting place, she was reunited in some symbolic sense with the father who once encouraged her budding artistry so many decades before. Her influence endures in small but resonant ways. The statue of Queen Victoria at Kensington Palace, hewn by Louise's own hands, stands as a reminder that art can be an act of both devotion and quiet rebellion. Lake Louise in Alberta draws visitors from across the globe, many unaware that its name honors a princess who once glided over Canadian ice and used her position to advocate for educational improvements. People who study the roots of certain British institutions, from nursing organizations to women's colleges, sometimes discover threads that trace back to Louise's patronage. And in the broader conversation about Victorian womanhood, she serves as an example of how even those born into gilded cages can, with perseverance, carve out spaces for personal passion and broader social impact. Ultimately, Louise Caroline Alberta remains a testament to how personal passions can illuminate even the most traditional roles. Her biography resonates not as a series of sensational rebellions, but as a steady, determined effort to shape her own path, whether sculpting late into the night, advocating for nurses in wartime, funding girls' schools, or exchanging letters with suffrage activists. She used her platform in ways that broadened opportunities for women and underscored the value of creativity. She showed that the image of a Victorian princess might be more layered than the standard portraits in gilded frames would suggest. And so her story continues to intrigue those who stumble upon her name in an old history book or wander past the statue she carved. It whispers of a princess who stood at the juncture of tradition and innovation, balancing the weight of her lineage with her personal desire for self-expression. It reminds us that within the halls of monarchy, a system famous for its rigid hierarchy, there has always been room for individuals who refused to remain confined. For Louise, that room was found in sculpture studios, philanthropic meetings, hospital wards, Canadian vistas, and even the quiet of her own private apartments, where she could dream of a world more open to female creativity and leadership. In the grand tapestry of Victorian and early modern history, hers is a thread of quiet defiance and enduring humanity, leaving behind an imprint as real as the chisel marks in marble and as lasting as the ideals she quietly championed.